Hello, while we're getting organized, I will just introduce myself. And my name is Joan Kerr, and I'm here to chair the session called Famine, What Do You Know About It? I am a community engagement person, and I actually work in a wide spectrum of issues, and I love peace and harmony as at the basis of all of my projects. And I always wondered why we don't have more of that. So listening to some of the sessions today, I'll just share a quick story while we're waiting, if that's okay. I'm a storyteller, so please forgive me. When we're talking about the nuclear disarmament, I was reflecting on a person that I met in Paris, France, last summer. And he was an elderly gentleman, and he worked for the British government in the 50s and 60s. And we were just talking and sharing stories. And he remarked to me that in Paris, the year before, he met this lovely young lady who was 21 years old. And so okay. And he said that when he was employed by the British government, his job was to be ready to get on a plane to bomb parts of Russia. And he met this young lady, and she was part in this village that he was supposed to bomb, had it the need being there, or the order, I guess. And he said to me, so I looked at him astonished, and he said, you know, I never put a face to the people that I would destroy. And that was shocking to me, because I always wondered what went through the heads of somebody who dropped a bomb on people. And he just remarked about this young lady, and I thought, wow, if we can start to humanize our actions instead of thinking about how much money we get paid, and I think that a lot of times we make different decisions. Anyway, neither of my speakers are here today.
Yes, we are. Evan Fraser is here.
Oh, I haven't seen him. Where is he?
Evan's here. Evan.
Oh, okay.
Evan Fraser, come up.
Evan Fraser, where are you? Please come up.
He came and introduced himself, and he must be out.
They're looking for him.
You're looking for his slides.
Oh, okay.
This
And is the professor ready to go?
Well, Mark Jacobson is in California, so we'll be doing him by Zoom, but Evan Fraser is here, and we'll be doing the thing. Did you find your slides?
Hi, Evan.
Oh.
How are you?
Yeah.
I'm Joe. Thank you for being here.
No, my pleasure.
Okay, so we'll start with you then.
I'm happy to do whatever you want.
Okay. Do we have the?
Go ahead.
Okay, please go.
So if you got my slide, that's great. If not, I'll just start extemporizing. So my name is Evan Fraser, and I work at the University of Guelph. I'll stand here so you've got access to the microphone. I'm a Canada Research Chair in the Department of Geography, and I also have the privilege of being the director of a new institute called the Arrell Food Institute. And I was so excited when Meta called me up about a month ago and asked me to speak to the issue of famine. And if we're talking about the riders of the apocalypse traversing the land, famine has to be one of the things we're talking about. And we probably want to begin by thinking about this issue with starting with the rehearsal of world population statistics. And as we probably all know, the world population stands a little north of 7 billion people and is expected to tap out at somewhere between 9.5 to 10 billion later this century. And the folks that I work with in the food security business argue that the rising demand for food that this population causes, combined with the rise of affluence in Asia in particular, means that we're going to have to produce about 70% more food by 2050, or else face a major crisis. That said, let's pause for a second and think about what that means. About 2 years ago, The Economist magazine ran a cover story on this issue called Feeding the Future or something like that. And in it, they quoted they sort of misquoted or slightly misquoted a very famous agricultural engineer, a man by the name of Norman Borlaug, as saying the following: to meet demand for the next generation, the farmers of the next 30 years are going to have to produce as much and more food than all the farmers have in all of human history. So that's a sort of a sobering statistic. That's a gargantuan task to, over the next generation, produce more food than our species has ever produced in the history of agriculture. So that's the challenge. And then against that challenge, we're going to have to deal with some major other challenges as well, such as climate change, of course. Climate change is expected to make it harder and more expensive to produce food in many of the world's most important bread baskets. So we immediately think, when we talk about climate change, of issues like drought, parched landscapes of the Sahel, massive famines being triggered by that sort of thing. Maybe a little closer to home, we could reflect on that year 2012. Anyone remember the spring of 2012? It was 6 years ago now. March break 2012. So I've got school-age kids, so I was outside in March break of 2012, and I was sowing grass seed in our lawn because it was 22 degrees Celsius. Well, the apple orchards all blossomed that week, all across Ontario. And then April actually became kind of normal again. And the apple orchards all lost their blossoms. 90% of Ontario's apple crop was destroyed that year. 90%. There was essentially no apple crop. I know some orchardists actually that went to the trouble of hiring helicopters to move the air around their orchards in April when the frost came to keep the blossoms from freezing. So that's a very expensive climate adaptation strategy, to put it mildly. But so this is a major problem, and I'd like to take us then now to this summer of 2012, which is a really quite revealing summer. So can I move these slides myself?
You'd have to sit over here if that's all right.
You don't have a clicker for me?
I don't have a clicker, I'm sorry.
All right. So would you rather me to use the microphone or use the slides?
Use the slides here.
Use
Yeah.
the mic.
Oh, use the mic. Oh, okay.
So I need the mic.
Yeah,
So can
and
you
tell me
maybe,
when to go forward.
can you,
Yeah.
okay, so just push forward a couple slides, please. Again. Another slide. And stop.
Yeah.
Okay, stop here. So that's okay, don't worry about it, that's fine. Okay, so I mean, well, I'd like to take you to the summer of 2011, 2012. So that late 2011, 2012 period. And that year was an amazing year. China had a drought. Canada had a pretty poor grain crop. And Russia had a drought linked with wildfires in their wheat harvest. And about 30% of Russia's harvest was destroyed in that summer of 2011. And that Russia made an interesting decision at that point. The Kremlin decided to stop exporting wheat into the international market. And if you hit, just wait 1 second. If you hit, when I say hit advance, we'll see the effect of that decision in just a sec. So what I'm about to show you here is some data on the global food price. So the y-axis here, the up and down axis, for those of you who are not statistically inclined, the y-axis is the United Nations Food Price Index. It gives us a snapshot in time of how much food costs. Data goes back to the 1990s, and if you hit go, you'll see the data unfold. So let's just pause for a second. Oh, can you back up, please? All right, good. So if you'll pause for a second and just look at this data. So we've got the flat stable prices between 1990 and 2008, when there was a price spike. And then you've got this crash, and then you've got the Kremlin's decision in 2011 to stop exporting, where we hit world record prices for food. Now, many people say that this is actually the beginning of that famine, that failure to feed ourselves. And that the high volatile prices of what's now the last 10 years, so we're out 10 years now from the beginning of this crisis, is essentially the new normal. We are in a high volatile price phase. I'm actually going to demolish part of this argument in a second. I'm going to undermine my own argument here with some other analysis. But before I undermine my own argument with this graph, let me just pause and say these high volatile prices are very problematic, to put it mildly, in terms of global food security. We get a sense of the political implications of this, and if you just throw us to the next slide, please, and hit again, by looking at these two photographs. So we don't put the next one up. What this photograph shows us is how much food you could buy on an African market in the country of Zambia in 2007, immediately before the first of that price inflection, and this is $1 worth of food. So $1 worth of food before the price spike of 2008 in Zambia. And if you just pause and look at it, you'll see some green leafy vegetables. You'll see some tomatoes. On the bottom left-hand corner is a bag of milk. The top left-hand corner, you can't quite see it in this light, but it's there's a little bag with some cooking oil. But the thing that should attract your attention, or I'd really like to point out, is right in the middle. Does someone want to shout out what they think is right in the middle? I can't quite point without. It's not mushrooms, but it is dried. It's dried fish, actually. It's a supply of dried fish. So that's this family's supply of protein. So if you fast forward from the scene exactly 1 year, now this is how much food $1 buys 1 year later. If you just give me one more slide, please. There we go. Oh, you did 2 slides. Back up. There we go. This is how much food you could buy for $1, so same amount of money on the same market in the same country 1 year later. And way less food, of course, and no fish. This family has now lost their supply of protein. If you go with one more slide, we get to see the political implications. If those are the food security implications, here are the political implications. And the map here is produced for us by the journalist Gwynne Dyer, who writes extensively about global politics. And he plotted out where in the world between 2008 and 2011 there were food riots. This is people taking violently to the streets, outraged over the price of their daily bread. And the thing that I'd have you take away from this slide is that food riots were extremely widespread and essentially a global phenomenon in that year. And if we zoom out from the global level into specific cases, we see some really interesting things. So just give me one more advance, please. There we go. So this photograph was taken in Egypt immediately before the Arab Spring in Tahrir Square, which began as food price riots. And if you look closely at this photograph, which is hard to do given the lighting, you see at the front, the gentleman at the front holding a French baguette. I've actually looked carefully at this photograph. I think I count 4 French baguettes raised into the air as an international sign of protest over an unfair food system that allows some to be stuffed while others go hungry. To give me another slide, I think we've got a photo. No, just back up one. There we go. If you give me this slide, if memory serves, this photograph comes from Haitian food riots in 2008, immediately before the toppling of the Haitian government. And again, if you look closely at the gentleman in the front foreground, he's raising a French baguette as if a machine gun. And it's a line of oncoming riot police that are coming down the line at him. And for those of us of a certain generation, I just referenced in a slightly tongue-in-cheek way the old Monty Python sketch involving John Cleese and the banana. Don't know if anybody remembers it.
Yes.
Come on, be as vicious as you like. Anyhow, moving along from that moment of silliness.
Piece of fruit.
Yeah.
Well, we could talk about that in a minute, but you're absolutely right. The reference here to let them eat cake. All right, so if you give me one more slide then, please. But let's pause for a second. The whole story I've told you so far is one of scarcity, one of population growth and demand rising, and our ability and questioning our ability to feed ourselves and the consequence of failing to feed ourselves. That's a story about global food security, but I actually don't think it's the right story, because the conclusion of that line of arguments is we simply produce more and we avert the crisis. And it's not as simple as producing more. So let me advance a few bits of data that should convince you that this is much more complicated than simply producing more food. So let me ask you for one slide. Okay, so this is the graph I showed you a second ago. I've left the food price data behind, but on the y-axis, instead of food price, if you give me one click, just one. There we go. On the y-axis, what we're gonna see now is food supply collected at the global level, again by the United Nations, in dietary calories available per person per day. So this is how much food there is in dietary calories. So give me one click. In 1990, there were 2,600 calories for every man, woman, and child on the planet. And here's what the trend looks like. Give me one more click, please. So this is really interesting. This is really, really interesting. So there's a few things we could spend a day talking about this slide right here. But there's 3 things I'll point out. First of all is the slope of the food supply line. It's positive. It's going up. There is more food available today than at any other point in human history. And this represents, I would argue, a technological accomplishment of the highest order. Now, this has come with significant social and environmental costs. We can spend time talking about those. But farmers have adopted technology, which has meant that production has stayed ahead of demand, significantly ahead of demand. And I'm about to lose my clicker, so I'm gonna have to move around here. All right, just give me. All right, so let me just do this. This is just easier. Okay, then in 2013, actually, the last year for which, well, I can't do that. Okay. In 2013, in the last year for which I'm able to get data, there were actually 2,850 calories per person per day. So that's the second thing I'd have you observe. You know, on average, we need somewhere between 20 and 2,200 calories per day for an active life. A 19-year-old male athlete needs more than a 94-year-old grandmother. But as a global average, something in the order of 2,200 calories per person per day is a pretty good number. We've got well and above that. So that's the second thing I'd have you point. The third thing I'd have you point is, for those of you who are statistically inclined, there is no correlation between price and supply. Price goes up, price comes down, price goes way up, price comes way down, price goes way, way, way up, supply advances. So there's no evidence at the global level that producing more will do anything to price. So that's the first point I'd have you take. There's no obvious rationale for increasing production or concluding that increasing production will actually lead to better nutrition or better food security or things like that. All right, give me another slide, please. So that doesn't mean that, that there's not a whole lot of really important things going on. And one of the things going on that we have to be thinking about is actually distribution, right? We've got all this food, how are we distributing it? And to give this sort of the issue of distribution a bit more of a visual tinge, I'd like to introduce you to, it's a photo essay called The Hungry Planet by two journalists, Peter Menzel and Faith DeLuzio. And about 5 years ago, these two journalists traveled around the world and they took formal family portraits where they posed each family from different countries around the world, and they posed them with 1 week's worth of groceries. So they give us a sense of what people are eating. And in this way, they introduce us to the Revis family from North Carolina, who spends $86.17 per person per week on food. And it's just pause for a second and admire the color of the North American diet. And I'm sure the Revis family are delightful people, and I feel a little badly because I often use this picture, and I feel sort of a little badly about poking fun at their diet. But it is an astoundingly red diet. All the pop-up here, drinks at the back, all the processed fast food in the front, and I think.
Yeah, veggies.
Yeah, there's the fruits and veggies. Yeah. And of course, it invites the obvious comparison with, and I'll get the next slide up. This is the Ntomo family from Mali. They spend $1.76 per person per week on food. And I think the comparison speaks for itself. We live in a world where about 800 million of us are chronically undernourished, and close to 2 billion of us have struggled with eating too much. So it doesn't feel like there's a shortage looming, at least at the global level. Another issue that we have to be tackling when we're thinking of feeding the future and averting this idea of a badly fed future is that of food waste. And I'll get the next slide up now. And I'll wave at you 3 times to advance the slide in a second, okay? So at the global level, we figure we waste about 1/3 of the world's food. So 1/3 of the food we produce simply never gets eaten. And in the global south, that often happens at the farm level within inefficient storage. But it's you and me who are doing it at the global level. So Metro Vancouver has done a fair bit of work on this. And Metro Vancouver gives us 3 statistics. The first one is 80,000 potatoes are thrown away each day in Metro Vancouver. Next, 30,000 eggs and 70,000 cups of milk. Wow. So you grow that out to Canada or a global population, and we are talking about a staggering inefficiency. And again, we could spend the entire day talking about this. Next slide, please. The next thing we have to be thinking about when we're talking about creating a better fed or more food secure future is what kind of food we're producing. And I heard somebody show that out a few minutes ago. And this is really revealing as well. What is going to appear on this slide on the left-hand side is what we should be eating according to dietary recommendations. So I'm going to show you Harvard's Healthy Eating Plate Model, which is a well-regarded nutritional recommendation. On the right-hand side, I'm going to show you what the world's actually producing. And to do this, I had an undergrad student a couple summers ago convert the world's agricultural statistics into dietary servings and aggregate them into food groups. So we start with the fruits and vegetables that the Harvard nutritionists say should be about half of our diet, 8 to 10 servings of fruit and veg per person per day. Well, on the right-hand side, that's how much fruit and veg we are producing. About 4 servings of fruit and vegetable are actually produced per person per day. So we're only producing a small fraction of what we need to. Yeah.
whole mix? What's happening to the bees in the world?
I can. And the short answer to what's happening to the bees is not very many good things. And we know that pollinators are in decline, which is really important. And I'm really glad you put your hand up at this moment, because while most of our cereal crops are either wind pollinated or pollinated through propagated through hybridization, most of our fruit and vegetables are wild pollinated, bumblebees, honeybees, butterflies, and the like. So if we want to increase the world's production of fruits and vegetables, we have to be especially attentive to the issue of pollinators. All right, let's keep moving on. So the next thing that the Harvard nutritionist suggests is that about 1/5 of our diet should be starches and grains, and in particular, we should be eating whole grains. However, about half of the world's food supply are starches and grains, and this is starches and grains for human consumption. This is not livestock feed. This is not crops produced primarily for bioethanol. We are vastly, just advanced twice, we are vastly overproducing fats and oils. Give me 4 clicks now. Meats and alternatives and dairy products are actually roughly in the right amounts for today, although when you see it as a pie chart, it doesn't necessarily come across that way. But the real clicker is the next thing. Off to the side down here, you give me a click, are those fruits, are those sugars that we should be limiting that actually represent a huge proportion of the global food supply. So what we're faced with is a mismatch between what agriculture is producing and what consumers ought to be eating. And there's lots of reasons for that mismatch. But if we want a better fed future, we need to be realigning, which has implications for consumers demanding more fruits and vegetables and just eating more. But we also have to invest in a lot of agricultural research and extension to get those fruits and vegetables produced. All right, next thing. The final point that I'll make about the challenges of feeding the future have to do with sustainability. And there's so many things we could talk about. We know that agriculture is responsible for about 1/3 of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, is the world's largest driver of biodiversity loss. It's the world's largest polluter of fresh water and the world's largest user of fresh water. So there's major environmental implications with how we do agriculture. Now, many of those trends are in the positive. We are producing more food with less greenhouse gas emissions than we used to. Technology is being very beneficial in that regard. But we still have some major sustainability issues. And just to give you a sense of those, I've chosen 2 slides to illustrate the sustainability issues associated with agriculture, that of antibiotic resistance. So as many of us are aware, the world is on the cusp of a post-antibiotic era, and we are so overusing our primary tool in the frontline fight against infectious diseases that these antibiotics are no longer as effective as they once were. And again, agriculture plays a role here. And I'll get you to advance the slides quickly in just a sec. So this data comes to us from the New England Journal of Medicine, and it shows where antibiotics are used in the US, which is very similar to Canada, but I've only got US data. And we start with 3 clicks. So we use a sliver of our antibiotics in crops, pets, and aquaculture. Another thing, that's the antibiotics we use for humans for clinical use. And the final click is antibiotics in livestock. Now, this is changing rapidly. Ontario just last year decided or changed the regulations. So no antibiotics my understanding is the regulations now are that no antibiotics utilized for humans are able to be used in the livestock industry anymore. Nevertheless, we have an enormous amount of work to be done on making agriculture's impact on the environment and on things like antimicrobial resistance. We have a huge amount of work to be done on that. So with one more slide, please. So last time in this talk, I'm going to quickly go back to that food price graph I started with. And I hope I've convinced you that this isn't really, food prices aren't really driven by population, and that a whole lot of other things are very, very significant in terms of agriculture. My last comment to you before I summarize is that it's not like nothing is driving agriculture. And just look at the shape of the food price graph and remember the last 20 years of history and politics. Does anyone want to shout out what might be a key driver of food price?
Corporate concentration.
Well, that's part of it, certainly.
GMOs.
I'm going to sidestep that. I'm going to sidestep that one. Won't you just give us the one advance, please? There we go. price of oil in US dollars per barrel, and let's look at how this data looks.
Oh.
So, oil politics, Middle East, energy policy, what we're doing with nuclear. These are driving food prices far more than things like supply and demand. So I'm going to ask you to advance the next few slides quickly for me. So my key messages for this short talk are: one, feeding the future is more to do with how we produce food, in other words, sustainability. Who gets food, equity and distribution. What kinds of food we're producing, the whole nutrition debate. And issues such as waste and energy policy. Those are the determinants of global food security over the next generation. It's not really about producing more. And I think the last slide should give you my name and coordinates, but I'm happy at this point to take questions. So, Joan, I'm happy to handle questions if you want, or you can help.
You look like you're good.
Okay. So I saw 1, 2, and then 3. So I'm going to go 1, 2, 3 as the order, and then 4 to you. All right, gentlemen there.
Thank you for. I'm sorry, John, I can't do that. Thank you for your presentation. I'm not being a skeptic, but having done some statistical sort of work in my past, that correlation of the food price and the oil price, it's correlated clearly. Can you just expand on the causal relationship?
Yeah, so that's a really, really good question. So why are oil prices and food prices in lockstep? And why did that happen starting in 2008? Before the earlier part of the data series, there's no relationship at all. So if you do this, a simple R-squared correlation, Pearson's correlation test, on the first 15 years, you've got a very, very low R-squared, a very high R-squared on the last 10 years. So that's an important distinction. Something happened around 2008. And a lot happened around 2008. A couple of things. One, farming has become very energy intensive. And so fertilizer costs and diesel prices are increasingly determining the price of food. So there's an input cost related to energy, which is playing a role here. So that's one thing. Secondly, and I think actually this is more significant, is that around the time of the 2008 financial crisis, a lot of the very, very largest investment firms, the BlackRocks and whatnot, started investing heavily in agriculture. And they were linking pension funds and long-term investments into agricultural futures markets as a hedge against inflation and a hedge against economic volatility, which had the effect of linking financial markets and food markets up together. And financial markets and energy markets have been linked up together for a long time. So I think, and I'm not being very econometric with my hand waving here, but I think what's happened is there's been a synchronization of different aspects of the economy, which touches many, many facets, and we're seeing one dimension of that in this. You at the back, I think, was the next one, and then we're going to come down here to you two. So yes, gentlemen there.
Yeah, thank you for your illuminating presentation. Although not an expert in that field, I have worked in many lesser developed countries around the world. So I would challenge your comment about the non-linkage of production and price on a local perspective. You know, whether it's onions in India or sorghum in Mali, they're all very sensitive to local conditions and the price as well.
Yeah, so I think that's very accurate.
The global average may be correct, but unfortunately people live and suffer at a local scale.
Yeah, so what I'm trying to do here, so I agree with your point. Local supply and demand issues, local production shocks definitely determine local prices, especially in markets that are not integrated into global economic systems. So there's a couple things that are important to note there. Increasingly, markets are integrated into global economic systems, and what happens in the Chicago grain futures is having a global effect, even in remote areas. So that's one thing to take note of. The second thing to take note of is that is at the global level, say at the level of the World Economic Forum, the cabal of rich and powerful entities that call a lot of the shots. I think it's important to divest them of the notion that simply pushing or pursuing increased yields at a global level will help anybody. And that's that sort of argument that I'm trying to make, that simply saying farmers need to produce 70% more to keep up with demand is not going to result, even if we achieve that goal, which I think we probably will, but even if we achieve that goal, that's not going to result in anybody going to bed better fed, more nutritiously fed, more food secure. And I think we need to be pushing against that sort of the global assumption that we just simply need to produce more to meet up with demand.
Understood, but I think farming needs to be divided into the modern energy-intensive sector versus the subsistence sector that, I don't know, maybe a billion people are exposed to, which are not linked to global markets.
Yeah, I mean, again, I'd say that increasingly, even small-scale subsistence farmers in Africa are subject to strange pressures from international commodity markets. And I've witnessed that, say, in Cameroon, for instance, where we saw very strong food riots in 2010, linked with increases in the price of commodities that were being imported. And that was resulting in all sorts of strange market distortions at the local level that was causing a lot of havoc with small-scale producers. But your point's taken. I mean, one of the best ways we can think of to address reduce poverty among smallholder agriculture is working specifically with women cooperatives to increase access to markets and help apply technology to boost production and help people get their products into markets. And that's a very powerful way of helping reduce poverty. All right, so I've got two questions. Why don't I take both of these questions at the same time?
Yeah.
So why don't you go, and then I'll respond, and then if we've got any more time, we'll do another one.
I thought your comment about 90% of the apple crop being wiped out was important, but I'd like through the question to build upon this. Like, I've looked at agriculture in Ontario over the past century, and it used to be that apple growing was more concentrated in areas with good microclimates that were resistant to these sorts of problems that you described. Now I see it as this reliance on, high technology, getting apples that are resistant, and the idea you can grow them anywhere in southern Ontario. And I think this shows the need for, more serious land use planning to protect these kinds of areas, and also encourage that the fruit be grown on, because a lot of instances we protect these microclimates for, grapes for alcohol, which more harm than good, and is generally a problem in food security in general, which is usually overlooked. At some of the best land that could be used for giving people fruit and vegetables, using for alcohol for harmful purposes.
All right, good comment. And gentleman to your left, or to my, you, yeah.
I'm working on food security and energy security. I have one question: that what is the local food production when it comes into the equation what we're talking about? Local food. Do we have increase the local food production in terms of quality and in quantity wise? Do we get the more security in food?
Yeah, so both are very good questions. Do I have time to answer them, or do we?
Just a couple minutes.
Running the clock down. So I'm going to try to answer both the question about local food and the question of microclimates together. My feeling is that for things like carbohydrates and grains, and for many of our proteins, we're probably going to be utilizing the quote large-scale global system. I'm trying to anticipate the world I think we're going to live in, not necessarily advocating for a particular world that I would like to live in. So let me be very clear here. My suspicion is that for many of our proteins and most of our carbohydrates, we will be relying on large-scale, globally traded commodities. And that is probably a system that even if we wanted to make it otherwise, it won't be otherwise. Where I think we can make progress at the local level is specifically in the fruits and vegetable category. And a combination of, as you said, careful land use planning and incentives for local markets and a strong consumer education program aimed at school kids to get them eating their veggies and get us used to eating more veggies, plus a reinvigoration of local markets, I think we can make some significant progress towards creating more circular food economies within our communities. And that will help address a number of issues, including the environmental issues, but also nutritional issues linked with our diets. I think I'm done though.
Yeah, good.
All right. Thank you very much.